and today we have a real interesting guest. He is a psychiatrist and a former intelligence worker. So that'll be interesting. But first, real quick, before we get into that, the Commandos Store. They sponsor this podcast. A real great company. They're an online military surplus store. They have incredible items from all over, mostly focusing on the Cold War, one of my favorite periods. One of the really interesting products they have this month is the South African Waxy boot. It's a boot from the Cold War, from South Africa, of all places. And they have a good deal on it. Check that out, along with millions of other great products. Again, that's the commandostore.com, Kommando with a K. And if you're a first-time purchaser, you get 5% off with our coupon code, TACOPS. That's all lowercase, no space in between that, TACOPS. We have a man who we're just going to go by the name of Doc. He worked in intelligence. Now he's a psychiatrist, I believe, right?
Correct.
He's from a Scandinavian country. We won't go into too much more detail than that. But do you want to start off maybe introducing yourself, talking a little bit about your background here?
Oh, yes. Talking about myself. That's lovely.
That's why you're on.
Well, where do you want to start, actually? It's a long story.
So, what we could do, actually, is I know you actually said a lot of this went back to your father.
Yeah, God rest him. He started out as a nuclear physicist working for the Americans in Los Alamos, but was native Scandinavian, so he left for home and family in the early 60s and ended up running a company doing consultant work in Africa during the Cold War. So all sorts of a very broad spectrum of projects all over Africa, actually, sub-Saharan Africa. So that was my first employer. That was my dad's company. And this being, of course, the Cold War, Africa was riddled with movements and governments supported by the various superpowers, which, of course, you can work there without having some kind of relationship with that scene. So I started out working for his company, and this brought me later into contact with an NGO, a non-governmental organization, working to support Rhodesia at first, and then South Africa in their struggle to defeat their opposing forces, I guess, if we want to try to be as objective as possible.
Okay.
Eventually losing. So it's still a politically somewhat, touchy subject, I guess. It's how do you say? Well, the winner gets to write history, right?
Yeah, and then there's also the racial issues. There's a bunch. So yeah, it is sensitive, but it's all history, and it's always fun to read about this stuff and learn about it, regardless of what side it was on. Just the people's stories.
I mean, the race issue was I would trying to be as objective as possible, but the race issues were inflated for propaganda reasons. We could go into specifics on that if we want to, but that's kind of part of the Psy war, right? That's an intelligence subject of itself. How the Western world perceived this as the black man's struggle against the whites. It has that. I mean, South Africa had race laws, right? You couldn't marry a black woman if you wanted to. So it's a partial truth. I mean, the takeover of Mugabe's forces in Rhodesia, they killed more blacks than anything else, right? They eradicated 20,000, 30,000 of other tribes to consolidate their power. So race is just one aspect of it, right? The world is always more complicated than narratives want it to be.
Very true. Yeah, everyone wants to boil it down into one issue that you can point your finger at and say that's the problem.
Right, wagging the dog, and now we're directly into intelligence, right? Because that was how Rhodesia was defeated, more or less, right, through propaganda war.
So if you don't know, because at least here in the U.S., they really don't cover much of African history in school. Eric and I were actually just talking about that before we started the podcast. Rhodesia was originally a British colony, and then it eventually became its own self-governing country. And then finally, it came to an end, and it is a modern-day country of Zimbabwe.
Right. They declared. They tried to the government of Ian Smith tried to declare itself independent, but you can't have unilateral declaration of independence, so they tried to negotiate some kind of deal with the Brits mainly and Americans, but every talk stranded, and they ended up doing exactly that, declaring a unilateral declaration of independence, leading to boycotts and embargoes and all that. Yeah. 1st of June, they declared independence on the 11th of November, 65, and was morphed into Zimbabwe in June of 79. So they existed for
not very long, 14 years, yeah. Not even 14
years of constant bush wars and trying to circumnavigate the embargoes. Yes.
So you were born in Scandinavia, but then you moved down and spent part of your life living there, correct?
Yeah, not in Rhodesia, but in Tanzania.
Okay.
Which was a communist dictatorship at the time, I guess. The Tanzanian Socialist Party, run from Moscow, it still are in charge, but has softened up since the wall fell, right? But during the Cold War era, it was a Marxist country, more or less. And then, I mean, you found training camps in Tanzania for the so-called, right, in part trained in neighboring countries, right, out of reach of the Rhodesian and South African forces.
Okay, so you told me your dad was a nuclear physicist?
Yes.
And so you kind of wanted to follow in his footsteps a little bit, so you do have some schooling in that.
Yeah, I eventually ended up at a university and wanted to follow in his footsteps. Who doesn't want to be like Dad, right?
Right.
So I tried studying physics and did that for a while, but my math wasn't strong enough, really. And so, I mean, what's the science subject with with the least math? That's biology. So I went to biology for a while and converted from there to medicine.
So then you went through medical school and...
Yeah, medical school. I worked as a military doctor for some time, prison doctor, and eventually found specialty in psychiatry to be interesting, right?
When did you start working in intelligence then for that Scandinavian country? When did you transform from your medical schooling into intelligence?
Well, how do you say, the majority of intelligence experience I have is from this non-governmental organization working for or against, I would say, the communists of Southern Africa. Originally founded to support the government of Ian Smith, and later did work in support of South Africa in Africa, but also in Europe. So that's my how do you say, my the experience that I have from intelligence work. I mean, directly. The consultant work after my medical degree is how do you say, unsubstantial in that it's a smaller part, right? It consists of consultant on specific topics, right? Left-wing extremism, right-wing extremism, that kind of thing.
That all factors in, because you told me so you were working specifically in human intelligence, right? The humans.
Yes, this NGO was around intelligence. That was the task, more or less, of what the activities were, right? The resources for advanced signal intelligence wasn't available at that time, except for like phone tapping and that kind of thing, which was, I guess, both harder and simpler at the same time back then, as everything was analog. The only thing you needed to tap a phone was a coil, right? Tape to the phone line, and you can hook up and listen to it. You don't have to breach the lines at all. So it was easier than it is today in that regard. I mean, anyone could do it. Now you need the know-how. If you understand what I'm saying.
Right. And now today, it seems like some of the intelligence agencies may be relying a little bit too much on technology because it's so easy to do stuff like that with the internet and with everything. But we can get to that part later.
That's a very interesting discussion. But
yeah, we'll definitely get to that. So I think your knowledge so you did psychiatry, or you went to school for medicine. I'm sure psychology factored into there too. So all that fits in real well with human intelligence, being able to analyze people, looking at them, trying to figure out their motives, trying to figure out what kind of person they are, who they are, what they're doing.
Exactly. Yeah. And the big task of today, of course, to identify the lone wolf terrorists. That's a big chunk of it, right? What's his name? Barrett, the last guy in New Zealand. Is there a way to identify these people prior to them attacking civilian targets, right?
Yeah.
It's a problem that every intelligence community is struggling with, because they seem to come out of nowhere. And this is a problem which, of course, I've been looking at and trying to contribute to a solution to, right?
Yeah. Yeah, now I think they rely on the internet a lot to try to look and see what websites they went to, or if they were posting on different chat rooms. But
right, maybe we can go there now if you want to. But the problem is this, that it's cheap with the dawn of the internet, right? And all its details, cell phones. Everybody's carrying around a microphone and a camera that you can access when you want to. Intelligence work becomes a lot easier, right? Traffic data, surveillance, it's all a keyboard application away. And you lose the human factor. You lose the boots on the ground, because it's so much cheaper to just do the electronic surveillance, and you lose the old school, well-trained operatives that really had the ability of producing a gut feeling, right, when meeting someone, and to a big extent succeeded by the infiltration of forums. And I mean, like, you have a forum of people angry at something, and you have operatives sitting behind computers, going into those forums, pretending to be one of the club and talking to people, right? Classic infiltration. But it's not the same thing, right? It's not the same thing as shaking someone's hand, looking into their eyes, talking to them over 4 beers. You get more information, human information, that way, right?
Oh, I bet. So with the technology today, is there any country that you see still staying to this old school form of intelligence better than others? Like one they always talk about is Israel with Mossad. I know they still do a lot of human intelligence. Or Germany, you've mentioned before. Any country, or maybe compared to the U.S. too, do you think they're doing an okay job, or relying a little bit too much on technology, or the Russians?
Well, first of all, it's a matter of funding, right? To surveillance the movement of someone in the old days, traveling by car, you needed a revolving tail, 8 to 10 cars revolving behind the person of interest, right? It takes a lot of money. Tracking a cell phone is so much cheaper. So it's a matter of funding, right? So those organizations that have the funding needed keep keep Human going, right? They still have those operatives. One being Germany, of course, who spends a vast amount of resources on political extremism inside Germany. And I mean, they still operate as they used to. There's seamless transitions between, you know, the Gestapo, the Stasi, and the modern operatives. They're of course not as ferocious and violent as they used to be, but they're down there, boots on the ground, next to you in a pub if you're an extremist, right? So it's the reason why you don't see that many. I mean, Germany has militant right-wingers, but you see very few attacks. This being the reason why, I guess, they know who they are and what they had for breakfast before they know it themselves. So they really kept this methodology alive. As for the Americans, I read about some of the sting operations the FBI conducted against extremism, and it looks very much like the, how do you say, the old ways. They seem to have kept this, let's go see him, let's talk to him, let's tempt him and see how radical this guy really is, more than just doing the signal intelligence, right? So it's not that as if it's disappeared, but it has the modern technology has taken a big chunk out of the funding, right? For intelligence. So where you had a department of 200 people working against or for something, you now have a lot of computers and 4 guys. So something are lost, right, along the way. And I would argue that human intelligence is better suited for identifying that, you know, the lone wolf type than electronic surveillance, because the problem with electronic surveillance is that how is the problem of sensitivity and specificity. What will your markers be? If you construct your net too tight, you get flooding, right? You get 150,000 people that need to be checked out. If you construct your net too widely, then you lose the guys that you're looking for. Right. And this was compensated for by the experience and the gut feeling of people who used to be good at listening and talking to people. Like, is this guy dangerous or not? That is, how do you say, one of those things that's hard to put into an algorithm. It's a complicated brain, right? Pulling on all sorts of experience and knowledge when talking to you and determining what kind of person you are. I mean, most of us do this all the time, just not in an intelligence setting, right? You go on a date, you have an impression of who this girl is. Do I want this girl or not, right? If you're picky, you go to 10 dates and you find the one that you think, yeah, this could be a future, right? This could be the one, and you don't really know why your gut is telling you that. Some of it is rational and cognitive, but most of it is subconscious, right? It just reminds you of something that was good, or I don't know. It's the non-conscious factors, and that is thoroughly lost when you convert to AI and technology, right?
Yeah, I think a good example of that would be like the polygraph, right? We doubled down on technology, but now you're finding out it has all these flaws and it's catching too much. It seems like it can't really pick out what a trained psychologist maybe could pick out, or somebody who's actually trained to look for maybe lies or nervousness or something like that, like an actual person.
Or different body language.
Exactly, body language and is probably, I had to look for that, but the polygraph has some weaknesses. One being that it measures not lies but stress. So who gets to fool a polygraph? Well, anyone who believes their own story, right?
Yeah.
You have mythomaniacs. They'll pass the polygraph test probably because they believe what they're telling you, right? They're just so caught up in their own stories they don't know that they're telling lies. And you have, I remember reading some results when studying polygraphy. They did this on psychopaths in prison and found that they found the same arousal, the same stress response in them as in the normal population when they were lying. But it wasn't during the lie, it was before the lie when they heard the questions. And the conclusion was that they looked so much forward to lying to you that they showed arousal when presented with an possibility to fool you. But while they were lying, they showed no signs of stress, right? Because they're so bloody good at it. So it is a very good example of technology providing bigger opportunities, but not a substitution. It should be seen as a complementary, right? So as adjuvant to what you're already doing, not as a substitution. Because, I mean, looking at someone who's telling a lie is, I would say it's more, probably has a higher sensitivity than a polygraph. But that's hard to tell because you have to subclassify the liar in front of you, right? Is it a mythomaniac or is it somebody trained to lie? We would have different results. People trained to lie will be very aware of their signs, right? They will be schooled in what would the interrogator look for to see if you're lying or not. And would try to deny themselves those kind of movements. And yeah.
So I thought it was so I'll tell a little bit of a story here. I think it was maybe 6 months ago. I have a channel on my Discord for geolocation. So I would post a picture of a random area, and then people would have to try to figure out where in the world, what city, what area it was taken on. And I remember one time I posted a picture, I think it was of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and you jumped on there, and you didn't talk about where it was, but you noticed one man standing in the corner. I think he was texting on his cell phone or looking at his cell phone screen. And you went through and started analyzing every last detail about him and talking about most likely what kind of person he was or his history, or because he was a little bit overweight, I think, and all these different little signs that I would never have noticed. I thought that was incredibly interesting.
Oh yeah, well that's occupational hazard, I guess. No, it's like you never sit with your back to the door.
Yeah.
Same thing, right? You sit back to the wall watching the doorway. You want to see who enters the restaurant, right? That's hard to do. Sit the other way.
Yeah, I do that. I find I do that. If you ask my girlfriend, I do that exact same thing. Anytime I go into a restaurant, I'll have to sit on the side where I can see the majority of the restaurant. She even asked me before we sit down which side, or she'll assume or be able to figure out where I want to sit just based on that. And the other interesting thing too is I know it kind of makes you a little unpopular with especially some of the new people. I've had a few complaints about you because they don't know how to take you at first because you will question things that most people I think will not question, and you'll take maybe unpopular viewpoints on different topics. For example, for one example was the poisoning in, was it Salisbury last year? Yeah, with the Russians were supposedly responsible for that, and pretty much everyone on the pro-American or pro-West said it was Russia. It was definitely them. Some people on the channel who are more pro-Russian, they said, "Oh no, it's all a British propaganda, and they did it themselves, and they're trying to blame it on the Russians." But then you actually went through, and I remember you posted a few pictures of them. I think it was going through the train station or getting off at the airport. Really going through and trying to talk about these people and what they were looking like and trying to figure out if they looked like they were guilty or up to something. Like I said, it might make you unpopular, but it's the asking questions like that, which I think would obviously come from your background, trying to really get into people and trying to figure out what their intentions are just based off, whatever information you have available. And that's all part of the propaganda war then too, right? Like we were talking about a little bit in Rhodesia with each side trying to play up and maximize different points to try to win in the propaganda war.
Yeah, and what has hit me with or what shaped maybe that extreme skepticism that I carry and you talk about is how the narratives in such conflicts are. Well, my trainer in Psywar and intelligence, he used to start where he started the first lecture with a sentence: the first law of psychological operations is that the first casualty of war is the truth. If you don't understand that, you can't train in Psywar, right? Because psychology wins wars. And especially in the day we are, or the time we're living in, a small world and massive communications, who can sway the public opinion the most will probably succeed in his agenda, right? And there are no good guys really when it comes to at least the way I see it now, looking back. There were no good guys, right? It's like the Balkans or the Cold War. You can argue as much as you want about, yeah, I would probably be a lot happier living under American rule than Russian because I like American cars, right? But that's a subjective standpoint. Yeah, that's my hobby. I restore and I kind of love the old American cars. They're built in a special, very appealing manner to me. Nice. So I would be much more happy restoring Chevys than Ladas, right? But that's a subjective point of view. If you take a step back, everything becomes, subjective, and then it's just a matter of who wins and who loses. It's a neutral position, I guess, and it's something that I think that's taught in every intelligence school all over the world, that if you are to do this work properly, you should strive for objectivity. And when you see the American intelligence community making mistakes, it's because they've lost that objectivity, right? If you are to understand intelligence that you have in front of you, if you are to group and properly weigh the data that you get from your sources, be they direct or indirect, you have to have a position of as much objectivity as possible. And that adds to it, I guess. I mean, the Salisbury attacks there were a lot of contradictions there, right? If you want to sneak into the United Kingdom to assassinate someone, you don't walk through Heathrow looking into the camera, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't really make sense. But, this is where conspiracy theories take off and say, oh, I know what happened because I can, right? I can't tell you what happened there, just that there were bits and pieces that I couldn't connect in a logical manner, right? So I guess that defends my position. You don't know who did this, right? It's like the Reichstag fire. Was it the communists or was it the Nazis themselves? You'll never know, right?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing I find about you is, like I said, a lot of people I think have a misunderstanding of you, especially at first, because they'll think, oh, you are saying that this happened, or you are saying that this did not happen. But from what I've seen, most times, I think actually, I can't think of any time really, you've never said definitively this happened, or you're wrong, this happened, or that happened. You just make observations, and then it's up to the higher ups, I guess, to a point, to make decisions on what to do with that information.
Exactly, and I'm much better at contradicting you than telling you what actually happened. And that goes to scientific model as well, right? Systematic doubt.
Yep.
If you are unable to doubt your own model, then you're a lousy intelligence worker, you're a lousy doctor, and you won't really get anywhere in your understanding of the world, right? If you're so full of your agenda that you interpret everything into it, I mean, the flat earthers being a perfectly good example of that. That's how you end up there, right? You interpret everything to fit with your own model. You get a selection bias, as you call it in scientific work. You should do the opposite. You should look for everything that does not fit with your theory, right? And that's what you do in intelligence analysis as well. You end up with a conclusion, and if you're a proficient intelligence worker, you go back to the starting point and say, okay, let's look for everything that does not fit with this model. And if you don't do that, you'll end up in a heap of trouble, right? And that's something liberating Afghanistan. What kind of idea is that? You don't fight a war to liberate anyone. The last time America tried it was in Vietnam. It didn't work very well, did it?
So that was more part of the propaganda war then.
Yeah, I think they ended up believing their own propaganda, high on Kool-Aid, right? Because the object of war is to defeat the enemy. And if the enemy if who the enemy is unclear to you, right? The preposition that the North and the Vietnamese or that the Afghanistan tribal communities want to be liberated. How do you know? Have you investigated that? Have you done research to it? Have you done polls? Asked them what do they want? No, probably not, right?
Right.
It's a good example of
if you
I don't know
will they answer honestly, right? Will you get an honest answer? You don't know, right?
Right.
That process takes a lot of work.
And if you don't ask that question and you get something like Tom's Shoes, right? You guys, I don't know if you Doc, I don't know if you've ever heard of Tom's Shoes, but in America it's a shoe company where if you buy shoes, they donate money or not necessarily money, they actually will donate. Like if you buy a pair of shoes, they'll give a pair of shoes to a kid in Africa, right? But then if you look into it, nobody wants their fucking shoes. Like nobody asked for these shoes. So now what happened is they took out the textile company and like all these people are suffering now because now there's just this influx of shoes that nobody wants, right? So it's like nobody wanted it in the first place, but Tom sold everybody and all these people that just were super ignorant and didn't know any better that they were going to be given these poor African kids who run around in dirt and no shoes, obviously, because that's all we see on TV. And they're gonna run around and they're gonna have shoes now. Oh, that's so great, we're gonna save the world. But now they're just throwing these shoes away. It's stupid. It's just ridiculous. Like you cannot just assume that what you're being told is correct. You have to look into it a little bit to see if that's even needed or not.
Right. And there's I have plenty of stories to support that view. I mean, my African nanny said it like that. He said that he was a male nanny, and not a problem in Africa, I suppose. But he said that you guys never learned. You had the Viking era where you conquered half the world, and then you had the colonial times where you conquered the entire world, and you say that you're sorry about it, but now you're here with your foreign aid. Right, and so he didn't see that as very different because what did it produce? This was in Tanzania, it produced a lot of corruption because there was a money flow, right? So the chief of police in Dar es Salaam needed his amount of cash to not protection money, what the mafia does, right? Yeah. So it produces a lot of corruption, and it produced industrialized fisheries, which nobody needed. And there was no one to buy the fish, right? But the foreign aid was constructed by the parliaments in the West, I guess, without adequate intelligence and research, right? So you ended up with projects that made no sense at all, like those shoes, right? That's kind of the story of foreign aid to Africa. The only thing you end up what you end up with, if there's a shoemaker somewhere in that region, he's out of business, right?
Yeah.
So that's one step backwards.
Yeah, it always has like that. What is it? The flapping of a butterfly wing can change the tides of war. Yeah, any change you make will have effects other places.
Exactly. So the counter indication, what's the possible harm of this project was never researched. Foreign aid is positive. Stop. Nothing. If you criticize it, you're being unemphatic, right? If you ask for, and nobody actually asked these populations of Africa what you need. That's the most interesting part, right? The construction of a lot of these projects was by Western creativity. Nobody asked, do you need industrialized fishing? right? What do you need to do? What do you need to prosper? That question wasn't really asked. It was assumed that Africa would undergo the same development as the Western world through the same means.
So is it a way of, I don't want to say colonization, but is it a similar to that, but in modern day? For example, in the 1800s, the 1700s, the big European powers would actually move in there and conquer it with their military and control it. But now it's being controlled not with military, but with products and with investments and loans through, again, these same big powers.
Very much so. You have the foreign aid that's well, here and there you find projects. I mean, health projects. Africa is climbing, when it comes to living standards and quality of life and all that. And then you see a climb from the 60s to now. They're slowly making their way up. Child mortality is dropping, etc. But it could have been more efficient, to say the least. And the other thing about Africa is that it's been kept in, or parts of it has been kept in, a perpetual state of civil war, right? Because it is the richest continent in the world. And there's a lot of people who want access to those riches. And access to neighboring countries to give them leverage when, etc., right? So there's a lot of big geopolitical conflicts and interests that meet in Africa due to the natural resources, and this has kept that continent down for since the decolonization. And you have examples where that does not happen, where you actually have an increase in prosperity and living standards. But yeah, it's a complicated issue, right? And it's the same. It's related to what we're discussing, because nobody really did the critical thinking. They just assumed that foreign aid is positive. Let's do it, right? Let's give them something. Let's give them shoes. That looks nice. It's not. It's probably not, right?
Yeah. So, and now you're seeing it today with China. Oh, go ahead. We can get into China.
I wanted to say something too real quick that, it's the efficiency of power, right? Like, to colonize means you have to now take care of these people. Whereas if you go in and just control the economy, you don't have to give them social security numbers. You don't have to, give them all these benefits of a citizen, right? Because look, we don't want new land. If we wanted new land, we, like as the United States, we would have made Puerto Rico a state a long time ago, or Guam, or Midway, all these places that are in flux when it comes to, being part of the United States. I don't think it's going to happen, just because now if they're civilians, now we have to pay, now we have to give them all these incentives, right? But it's cheaper for us not to. That's why I think that's one of the reasons colonization died. It's just cheaper to control a country with the economics than it is to have to actually go in and build an entire state. You don't even have to build a Capitol building. You don't even put an embassy there or anything. You could just control it through the back door.
Correct. And you're right on the mark. I mean, I think the Brits spent more in Africa than they got out of it. I don't have the actual numbers, but I think they lost money through their conquest of Africa. It cost them more to uphold it than they could earn from it. So that was probably one of the reasons for the decolonization, right? It wasn't viable as it was. So you go for the next best, right? You control the president and the economy, which is what the superpowers did during the Cold War, right? They bought and sold governments.
And that brings us then perfectly into China, because that's pretty much what China there is doing today in Africa, with giving massive loans and building projects or building roads and investing heavily in there to then get them in debt to China, and they can control the resources, as you were talking about.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know how the Chinese influence in Africa went under the radar for like 40 years. But they Mugabe's party, the SANU, was run by China, right? And the army, the militant branch of his party was run from China. So he was actually a Chinese puppeteer in Rhodesia, later Zimbabwe. So they own this from 79 and onwards, and they were active in South Africa with the Pan-African Congress. So China's been active on the African stage since the dawn of the Cold War, almost since they were in a position where they were able to. North Korea, right? North Korea trained the 5th Brigade of Mugabe's forces in Rhodesia. They were invited to and had how do you say, training personnel arriving in Zimbabwe, training elite forces. So it's an old connection. It's just not very well known, and I've seen very little written about that. I mean, China's role in Africa.
I think people just more focused on the superpowers at the time, the Soviet Union and the U.S. And then after the Cold War, I think the U.S. just wanted to kick back a little bit and enjoy being the sole superpower and pretend like there were no issues. I think now we're getting to the point where we're looking around and noticing some of this stuff more.
Yeah, and it sort of amazes me that, well, that's a sad story, really, because I have the impression that Washington did not want a regional superpower like South Africa, and that was part of why they did not support South Africa fighting Russian proxies, right? Because you should think, you would expect that Washington would support South Africa when fighting Russian and Chinese proxies, but I think they feared the regional superpower South Africa more than they fear the commies actually in Africa. I wouldn't know. It's just a half qualified guess, but the lack of focus on, at least in the public eye, on what China has done and is doing in Africa, much of which is not very nice. I mean, the 5th Brigade ended up slaughtering 20,000 people, black people. I mean, the Shona people were massacred by the forces that the North Koreans trained. This is not in no history book that I know of, and it's been under-communicated in the public eye. So that's one thing I really don't. I'm unable to understand. I mean, why they let China have their darkness to work in the shadows. That's somewhat strange to me.
So maybe
I have no explanation.
Maybe going back to propaganda a little bit. Do you think propaganda is getting easier or harder today with technology? Like, for example, you would think it would have been easier in the past since there was less technology. For example, YouTube or social media where anyone could say what's going on. But then at the same time, there's with technology that enables governments to better control in a way some information. So do you think it's gotten easier or harder?
Yes and no. Depends on what aspect of it you're looking at. I mean, I think people are easier to fool today. I think not easier to fool perhaps, but I was comparing. There's a YouTube channel called it's a channel that has interviewed and publicized interviews with a lot of Medal of Honor recipients who have amazing stories, right? The biggest heroes America can produce, and it has the 29,000 subscribers. PewDiePie has 100 million or whatever it is.
Yeah. A lot more than
something wrong there, right? You have the biggest heroes in modern American history, and 29,000 people are watching them tell their stories.
Huh.
But 100 million are watching PewDiePie. That seems like a propaganda possibility, right? Just get that one guy to say something, and you have 100 million subscribers.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think well, it goes back to what you were saying about why people are provoked by my position. Critical thinking is becoming unpopular. that's a whole other can to open, but it has to do with sociology and is very well understood by a guy called David Riesman, and his proposition is that people are more focused now on what the people around them, what's the position of 7 of my friends, like a school of fish. One mackerel in a school of fish has to orient itself by looking at 7 other mackerels. That's how they are so coordinated as they are, and the modern human is doing the same thing. What's the position of my friends? Okay, that's the position I'm going in. So if you have the means to produce a public narrative, people will fall into it. If you don't have it, you are not you have no access to the scene, right? Where you before had to present a good argument, right? If you read the old books on how to convince someone, it will say that you need a good argument. You need to think through, and you need to be as honest as possible, but still producing a narrative, right? That's the old manual. The new manual isn't really like that at all, I think. You remember the Kony 2012 campaign? This guy that wanted focus on a warlord of Africa that nobody had seen for 5 years. I think it was
yes. Yep.
he wanted to make money from it, right? So he produced a video called Kony 2012 and wanted to sell people merchandise with this guy's name on it. And he wasn't really a problem anymore, right?
I forgot about him, yeah.
Yeah, as a weird general from way back, right? And probably dead for the last 5 years. And this guy, and probably as a business investment, right? Started this Kony 2012 campaign. And people went along with it. I mean, Facebook was full of, Kony 2012. That kind of changes the deal a little bit, right? The lack of critical thinking. Nobody was saying, well, who is this Kony anyways? And let's look at objective sources. What does Washington say about him? Nothing like that. It was just, oh my God, this is terrible. Let's do something. It's kind of a hysterical way of looking at it, but it's what happens when you lose critical thinking. It becomes hyper synchron. Actually, it becomes like a school of fish, which means that pushing a narrative becomes easier and harder at the same time, because you have to have the cash to buy PewDiePie to sell your narrative. But if you can, then it's probably pretty easy, right?
Yeah, and you see it all the time now too. In American politics, at least, I'm sure it's in European politics as well. President Trump, for example. I know we try not to get into politics too much on this podcast, but he came. Most typical politicians would do what you were saying. They would have a narrative. They would try to speak as many truths and facts as possible. And then here you have, President Trump came out. Well, he wasn't president at the time, but when he was running, just ran in a completely different fashion than every other politician had in the past. And it just, people didn't know how to take it, and they didn't know how to react to it, or how to challenge it, or debate against it.
Right, because there isn't really a debate. Right,
it's more trying to one up the other person.
Yeah, it's not an exchange of ideas. It's not, let's figure out who's wrong, you or I. It's I'm selling a product, right? It looks more like you're trying to sell a Ford or a shoe, right, than a presidency.
The short 1 minute clips, like whoever can get in the best one liner.
Yeah.
Instead of a long drawn out debate.
And it changes everything, right? And the best example is actually from British politics, where they abandoned party programs altogether and just produced focus groups. They just asked a statistically significant number of people, what are the subjects most important to you, and that became their program, right? So they were re-elected. It was in 2003 or 2004. So they just applied psychiatry, actually. Focus groups stemming from folks' group therapy and the archetype stemming from Jung. So they just applied this well-known psychiatry to politics and said, okay, let's find out what's important to people, and let's find out what their opinions are, and let's just make that our politics. So they just abandoned ideology altogether. it becomes about selling yourself as a product, I guess. And I mean, I have no political affiliation or opinion at all. I follow the gospel according to George Carlin, right? When you're born into this world, you're born into a freak show, and he says, well, when you're born in America, you have a front row seat, and I'm the guy with the clipboard going, "Wow, did you see that?" And I note it down. I find that a beautiful way of looking at it, and I mean, you don't have to be political about it. Actually, it's just it's not bad. It's just another way of running a society, another way of being human. But let's look at it for what it is, and what you describe about Trump. You see that in Obama as well. Remember his campaigning? Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. That's kind of borrowed from hypnotherapy, right?
Hmm.
It's you just repeat, yes, we can. Sounds positive. We are here together. We can do this. What exactly? I never caught that.
Well, and you see it everywhere too, for even down to YouTube videos or political articles where they're just trying to say CNN or somebody on the right, say Donald Trump says something, and CNN commentator absolutely destroys him. Or you'll see like Ben Shapiro, who's somebody on the right in the U.S. here, absolutely destroys, Kamala Harris or whoever else on the left. It's just trying to get in those punches and not actually the whole fight.
Exactly. And well, I wouldn't call it worse or better. It's just changing. It's changing the nature of propaganda. So it goes back to your question: is it harder or easier now? Well, the rules have certainly changed. The rules have changed in what you present. The rules have changed as to how you present it. Right? Look at the Russian offensive in Western media. Right? Russia Today and several other. It's a big conglomerate that they produced. It's a mix of actual flag carriers like Russia Today, not hiding that they are affiliated with the Russian government, and then you have those actors that pretend that they're not affiliated with the Russian government, presents themselves as independent. So it's obvious to me that Moscow understood this, right? Well, how do we wag the dog in the year 2019? That's different from 30 years ago. So it's become, I would say, it's become easier in that if you first can get the ball rolling, it gains momentum much faster because there's no criticism within the ranks of your followers. But getting the ball to roll is harder because there's a lot more actors saying. I mean, the problem is too much information, right? If
Yeah.
you control the one newspaper in a town, then you have awesome power. That situation no longer exists.
No.
But now you can the modern equivalent would be you are PewDiePie, right? Because every other voice that are probably a lot more worth looking at. That was the example with the Medal of Honor recipients. That's a lot, to me at least, more valuable information than whatever game PewDiePie is playing or what nylon socks he's trying out this week, right? But it drowns out the voices that actually have something to contribute as to understanding. So you're in kind of in the opposite situation, but with the same result. You have as many papers in this town as you could wish for, but people are still just reading one.
Yeah, I find that interesting with the internet. I've thought about. So, for example, before the internet, you really couldn't look up different facts and find out all these different things unless you read it through a book or went to school. Then when the internet came along, I think a lot of people thought, this was the age of truth. We would be able to, if somebody was lying to you, you would be able to look it up right away, and we would all be able to know what reality and what the truth really is. But that has not happened. It's become the opposite. I think a lot of people just the internet is so segregated. It's broken into different pieces where you will only hear and see and watch what your own group or what your own people who believe in things similar or who have similar beliefs to you are saying. It's just become an echo chamber.
Right, which you had in the old days as well. The communists were reading communist newspapers, the fascists were reading fascist papers, right? So it's more of the same, but in a new wrapping, right? You have access to everything, but the human mind still seeks out what confirmates what you think you already know. And this is, I mean, this is the basics of why you need academia, because you need to teach people systematically asking questions about their own beliefs, right? This is my conviction. I'm a Christian, or I'm a Muslim, or I'm a fascist, or I'm a communist. Okay, look for anything that doesn't quite fit. Look for data that contradicts your model, right? That's intellectual
Absolutely.
honesty, right? That's being more than an ape. That's being intellectually honest. Look for things that contradicts my model. And if you do that constantly, you'll get better and better models of the world, right? Because the world is never completely as your model of it will be. So, I mean, understanding the world is trying to make your brain construct a model of the world that is dynamic, that's constantly in communication with the world and bettering itself as the data flow comes in, right? So there's an overlap between how the mind works when you do that and how you do intelligence work, or how you do medicine, or how you do, I mean, policing, right? Law enforcement would have to work in the same way to find the right guy. What's contradicting our belief that this is the perpetrator? That's how a good cop thinks, right? So if you lose that ability, then you're kind of in trouble, right? You're in danger of ending up where the Roman Catholic Church was in the 1300s, the Dark Ages, where what the priest said was the truth, right? And nobody had anything to say about it because they didn't know any better, or because they didn't dare to question it. And that's kind of that has some similarity to what we're seeing now. It's a dark outlook, but it's I and again, contradict me if I'm wrong, but people seem to be divided into camps, sure, but within those camps there are no contradictions. I mean, you're loyal to your camp, and that loyalty is above everything else. Anyone saying, you know, make America great again, and anybody who stands up and say, well, how exactly?
Yeah, I think that can't be overstated. The importance of that. Like, I'm not. I never get into it, but I have my own political beliefs. But I try to all the time read the other side directly from them to see where I'm wrong. Because if I'm wrong, I want to know. I don't want to be wrong. I want to know the truth. And it's hard to do sometimes. It's hard to challenge your own beliefs because it's like it's a part of you. Yeah, it makes up almost your human identity, and it's very difficult to do. But it's something that people need to do.
Yeah, it's an exercise in pain, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not
You
easy.
think, yeah, you think you know something, you think you have a comprehensive model, somebody presents a data set to you that doesn't really fit with your model, but you can't really find a fault in their data, right? So what do? You tell them they're an idiot.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
So you don't have to challenge yourself, because challenging yourself takes stamina. It takes the ability to handle the psychological pain that being wrong induces, right? We all like to be right. It's a hard thing to do, right? It's like running 20 kilometers. You have to train to be able to do it.
right. Right, and I think a lot of people have a literacy problem. I honestly think it's like reading at this point. People just don't know how to navigate all this information. It's just like reading. You could sit there and they believe exactly what is there, right? It's like Greg said. We all assumed that's what was going to be. This was going to be the truth. This was going to be everything we needed. So now people kind of assume that, and they don't have the literacy and the understanding to navigate through all this and try to figure out where the right stuff is, right? Because we see shit from the Daily Sun and all this stuff. It's just like you're seeing everything. It's like walking through the tabloid section and the newspaper section and the library all at the same time. But what's what? I don't know where the library starts and where the tabloids start. So everybody's trying to look like the library. Everybody's trying to look credible. They're doing the best they can to try to look credible. most of them anyways, and it's confusing. Yeah.
I would say be humble, right? The best teachers, the best lecturers I've had when it comes to, well, both medicine and intelligence, they have something in common. It's, I don't know everything. My profession is qualified guessing, right? That's the profession of a doctor, and that's the profession of an intelligence operative. Qualified guessing, right? If I'm an intelligence analyst, I never have the truth. The difference between the world and my model of it is always a nightmare, right? That's always the thing that haunts you in medicine. What have I overlooked? What didn't I understand? What dots did I connect that weren't really supposed to be connected? That's what haunts you at night if you've been working with a particularly difficult case. It's the same thing with intelligence work. I have an old associate and an amazing guy who said he was asked after a major terrorist event happened, what was your first reaction to it? And he said that I failed. I should have known this. I should have known this in advance. Impossible. It proved itself impossible to have known, but that's his first instinct, right? My job is to prevent these things from happening. Now it happened. I failed. So that discrepancy between what I think I know and what's actually going on in the world, that gap is extremely important if you want to understand the world, right? If you don't want to go into one of those echo chambers and be self-congratulatory and say, I know what this all is about, then you're in trouble, actually. Now, this has been measured in psychology, right? That the less you know, the more the Dunning-Kruger effect. The less you know, the more you think you know. That's a scary thought, right?
Yeah. So then getting back to intelligence a little bit, when you're trying to sort through all this information you're receiving, do you have a way of classifying it? Actually, I thought that was really interesting. You told me about a classification system that you'd break down with different numbers and letters to qualify the information. You want to go over that a little bit? I think people would find that interesting.
Yeah, that's highly relevant because to put it into context, I regularly sit and smile to myself when I'm looking at Twitter accounts calling themselves intelligence analysts, and they're more hysterical than anyone else, right? It's now this is it people. Now it's happening, right? Because some aunt in Damascus tweeted that she saw something, right? And it becomes it spreads like wildfire, and you have an entire community of people watching for these events going, now there's a third world war, right? and I'm having, and coffee is running out of my nose because I'm laughing my ass off, right? Because that is exactly the thing that you're talking about is lacking, the ability to weigh data and to understand the sources. So the first thing you need to do is to separate direct from indirect data. Direct data being you listened in on a conversation between the two generals, right? That's direct data. Or you listen to somebody's phone call, or read their emails, right? And you have direct access to data from the world as it is. Then you have indirect data, what your sources are telling you. And then it becomes more complicated, right? Because you can't trust indirect data the same way you trust direct data. This meaning that signal intelligence, for instance, would be direct data. Of course, you can, and the Russians often do, right, and the Americans too, send false data, right? And the Second World War was full of that, trying to get the Germans to think that the invasion came in Calais was riddled with transmitting direct data indicating a Calais landing, and it worked. So you can manipulate direct data, but you have a tendency to trust those more, right? Especially if the person of interest doesn't know that you're listening, then that's kind of a one class of data in itself. Then you have the indirect data. Okay, what's that? That is when you're sitting in Kabul and some young Afghani tells you something because he has an uncle that's with the Taliban and he knows somebody, and I overheard them. Somebody is telling you something else, like you call it hearsay, I think, in justice in America, right? So then it becomes indirect. Then you need some way of determining what's good and what's bad indirect data, because it's always morphed, right? That's the precondition here, that it's always damaged data. I don't know if you play that whispering game in kindergarten or in primary school, where you're supposed to pass a message down the line, and when it comes back, it's something completely different, right? You know this?
Yeah, I remember they called it telephone. Yep.
Right. Yeah. And that's the problem with indirect data, right? It always gets morphed one way or the other. So then you have a classification system, and you classify the source from A to F. A being excellent history of providing very good data, and motivation also comes in here. That's the next thing we could talk about. So just postpone that for later. But then you have A to F, where A is excellent history. He's a credible dude. E is usually a liar, or he's doing this for the cash and he doesn't care about the quality of what he's giving you. And F being unclassified, right? So you A, B, C, D, E, F. So you assign your source an A to E plus F value. And then you classify the data that your source is providing, 1 to 6. 1 being excellent data that is logical and fits with the data you already have, and 5 being horrible data, probably not true, probably a lie, and 6 being unclassified. So that's the basic rundown of how you classify the quality of the data, right? And then you have the human factor. The A to F thing then becomes, what is the motive of this person? Why is he giving you this data? Who is he? Does he actually have access to the sources he claims, etc., etc.? Then you have to know something about him. So this very, very fast becomes a matter of huge amounts of paperwork, right? Because you have to go through all these motions. And that's before you have information, right? Because this is just a collection process. You're collecting data, right? And you don't want your later analysis to contain data that is corrupt. Especially if you have an opposing force that is feeding you misinformation and disinformation, right? And then they can actually produce an outcome that's not representative with the actual, how to say, a gap between the real world and what you think it is. So it becomes a game, right? And that's what people know from the movies, I guess, or the books of some of these authors, that it becomes a game of trying to understand what's the opposing force doing to trying to corrupt our data, and how do we deal with that, and identifying and understanding the various sources, right? You have, for instance, you have a lot of strange phenomena that has to do with how the human mind works. You can have an excellent source, but at one point he dries up, as they call it, has no more to tell you, but he wants to stay in the relationship, right? It's makes him feel like he's somebody. Or if you pay him, he wants to get paid, so he starts producing data, right? He becomes creative. And you have the Taylor effect. If you read The Taylor of Panama, right? The Taylor that produced an entire scenario that had no link to the truth at all. So you have to constantly reevaluate these sources, right? What was an A source yesterday could quickly become an E source 2 months from now, as he's running out of things to tell you.
So that must have been a nightmare to try to keep all this stuff straight, especially in the days before good computers where you can search by keyword or search by different things.
Enormous archives. And you have to file. I mean, you have to know something about the source as well. So you have to profile the source, right? What's the motive? What's the background? What will happen in the future? Try to forecast what will happen to them in the future, right? What happens when they dry up? Will they dry up? And you have to look at this in conjunction to other sources. Are they saying the same thing? Are they endless meetings and tons of paperwork? Right? A hell of a lot boring than most people think. But I mean, the how do you say, the James Bond aspect of it is what, 2% of intelligence, if it exists at all. I mean, the operative going in getting documents, that's what, a percentage perhaps. Most of it is
and shooting his way out too, right?
Yeah, and shooting his way out, right? That's not the real world. That's a nice novel and cool movies, but you wouldn't get the broad picture doing that. You'd get that fragment of data, perhaps. And such operations was conducted during the Cold War. I mean, archives were stolen and break-ins, and so it has some element of truth to it. But any job looks cool when you see it on TV, right? Because they edit out the boring parts.
Right.
And being a doctor isn't that cool, right? It's 60-70% paperwork now, and the clinical part of it is usually the same thing over and over and over again. But it looks really cool on TV, right? Because you get to save lives, and there's House, right? House MD. It's difficult cases, and that's nowhere near the real world, and it's the same thing here, right?
I can imagine James Bond would not have become as popular if, instead of showing him running around with a gun and sleeping with beautiful women, instead they just showed him sitting in a big archive room, searching through files, trying to classify different sources.
Try and classify
for an hour and a half.
Sources with an ugly adjutant, with an ugly secretary, right? That's not sexy.
Nope.
Right, so it's a paper tiger thing, really. Except for such things as, I mean, you have the game of, I mean, can you trust your sources, right? You go to meet the source. Can you trust that source, or will somebody else be waiting for you? That's kind of the adrenaline part of it, right?
Well, yeah, that's the big thing too. Then, so yeah, I mean, there was double agents then, so to say, right? That you might be meeting with, who might be purposely giving you false information.
Yeah, or he could be standing under distress, right? The opposing force could have found him out and forced him to set you up, right? Then you're the source of intelligence if they can capture you. So that will be the adrenaline part of it, right? And an entire and a book of its own, several thousand pages long. How to run sources. That's a science of itself. The classify their motivation, which falls into 5-6 categories, right? And with its different dynamics and knowing where you are, right? What version of a source is this? And what will he flip on me, or will he not? And what happens when he runs out? Like I said, when he dries up, and could he be found out, right? What happens if they're good at what they're doing, the opposing force? If they identify this as a source, what's their course of action? Will they start misinformation campaigns, use your source against you, or will they try to capture you, or what? Yeah, it's a whole science.
That must be incredibly stressful.
Extremely. Extremely. It's how do you say? It's one of those situations where you feel rather alone, right?
Right. Like, who can you trust? Yeah.
Yeah, and you can trust your own people, right? But you never know. You deal with, people who inform on their friends aren't really, how do you say? They're not really the best people around, right? They have a loyalty problem to begin with, usually.
Right.
They're informing on their own friends, usually, if they're good sources, right? So So they would be what you used to call a traitor, right? Somebody informing the Russians on what the Americans are doing, right? That would be treason. And you can understand them from a psychological level, right? All people have their stories and their struggles, and you can understand their choice of actions, but they do have a loyalty problem. Loyalty is not their primary perk, right? So when will you always have to ask yourself that question? When will they flip on me? Like, you should never date a girl that already has a boyfriend, and you know where that will end up, don't you?
Right. Yeah, it's that saying they have here. I know I've heard people say, "How you get them is how you lose them."
Exactly.
So if they're cheating, if you're cheating with a girl who's in a relationship with someone else, then most likely that's gonna happen to you. Someone else will be cheating with your girlfriend.
Yeah, that's Dante's Inferno, right? Conviction fits the crime.
Yep.
So
Exactly.
you have the same thing here, right? And it has happened. I mean, it's I don't think that's so much of a secret, but you know, you have had sources in Afghanistan working both ways. Right, you have had people who were sources to the NATO military intelligence that where the data actually were flowing in both directions.
You could imagine, yeah, some of these people might just be in it for the financial incentive to make money from whoever will pay them more.
Yeah, and then you have and they're not to go into detail, but you know, the connection between that and the green on blue incidents, right? They gain information or data on how the NATO security works, right? How to get through the gate, because they go in and out of these bases, right? So that's a very pressing problem. You have a wonderful source, but is he only your source? Again, with a marriage analogy, right? This is your girl, but is she your girl alone, or does she have more daddies around? Right? It's the same. It's people are people, right? We're working with the human mind here.
So
and
then,
you have to ask the same questions, right?
So then I guess we can go a little bit back into your medical schooling and being a psychiatrist. Now, what's the difference for people? The difference between psychiatry and psychology?
Well, psychology, the epithet, or what you want to call it. Psych means soul in ancient Greek. Not the soul that not the Christian soul, not the soul that every person carries around that is his or her own, but the common soul, that's between heads, between people. That's psych. So psychology is the science of how the human mind works, and psychiatry is the treatment of that mind. Iatros in Greek meaning treatment. So psychiatros meaning the treatment of the soul, and psychology meaning the science of the soul, right? Or the teachings of the soul. And a psychiatrist will be somebody who has done an MD and then chosen psychiatry as their specialty instead of, say, internal medicine or surgery. And a psychologist will be somebody who concluded as a psychology degree, right? A non-med school education. So the differences are bigger than most people imagine, because the names are similar, I guess. It's interesting though that I rarely meet people who know the difference if they're outside, mental health. It's those two titles are commonly confused. But that's the difference, right?
So you worked when you were in the armed forces. You worked in psych. You mentioned to me before we started recording that you were working in selection for flight school, officer academies, special forces. So you'd actually go through and talk to these people and try to make sure that their heads are straight, examine their state of mind.
Yeah, you're supposed to be healthy. You can't, at least it used to be that in my time, you can't have a mental issue or problem and be part of an armed force, right? So you need to make sure that they are psychologically intact, and this goes for all branches, at least in Europe. I can't imagine it's very different in the United States. But if you had 3 recurring depressions, you probably should not be a fighter pilot, right?
Right.
And if you're hiding 3 consecutive depressions from the selection officer, that means that you're a liar. Then you probably shouldn't be a fighter pilot either, right?
Right.
So you and people do, right. If you Google it, you'll see that, you know, if you had this or that mental disorder, then a military career is probably not for you, right? There are some exceptions, I have to say that, you know, we always used to see that in context. I mean, if your dad died at 15 and then you went into the depression, that does not disqualify you, just to make that absolutely clear. But, you know, if you have a recurring mental problem, then armed forces is not your career choice that anybody would recommend. Not only caring for the armed force, but also for the candidate, right? You will be under extreme pressure. Well, there's a lot of young people in your sphere, right? And I see a lot of them are wanting a military career, right? Fascinated by military technology. So yeah. It's probably a relevant issue, you know. What discludes me? How do you say? What excludes me from seeking a military career, right? And that's one of the things, right? If you are not robust in your psychological functioning, it's not a job one can recommend. And applying and going through and failing isn't good for anyone, right? It feels like a failure. So I'd say that's a relevant point.
Especially in any high stress field, like, for example, what we were talking about before with intelligence, where you're meeting with sources and you have no idea if the person is going to arrest you, all of a sudden arrest you or kill you or turn on you or is lying to you or telling you the truth. You don't want that person to be snapping at that point.
No, absolutely not. And you have to some extent love your source, right? These are often not the best people around, but you have to develop some sort of repertoire emotionally. It's a kind of a dirty business in that way. There's a lot of, I mean, the law enforcement works like this all the time, and it's a major influx of intelligence for them. And there's books written about how to relate to your source in a professional manner. And there's 2 ditches to drive into. One is hating everyone because they're criminal and they're the enemy, right? Then you won't get the quality information. And then there's the other ditch, and that's you move in too close and you become friends with them, and you end up, you know, helping them in their criminal endeavor. There's fascinating publications done on that. Experiences from law enforcement when they're dealing with the dynamics between the one running the source and the source, right? Because the human factor develops there as well. So what kind of relationship do you want, and what kind of relationship do you not want? Goes to the motive of the man giving them information again. So a very interesting survey done where they group the motivation of the criminal to inform the police, right? And they fit into 5 or 6 categories. And from that you can forecast how the relationship will evolve. So this is actually a science now in modern law enforcement. And it's to me at least incredibly interesting to read, you know, the systematic scientific approach to this, the dynamics between the officer and the source.
Yeah, I was watching I forget the name of it, but it was a new show they made on Netflix, and it's about how the FBI developed a system or a program to actually analyze and use psychology and try to figure out the motive and what drives serial killers
Right,
to kill.
the profiling.
Yes, yep.
The profiling detachment, right? Yeah.
Yep, it was when they first started doing that. It was brand new at the time, back in the 70s, I believe it was, or the 60s, trying to figure out and then trying to use that information to predict who might become a serial killer in the future. Obviously, you cannot arrest somebody who has not committed the crime yet, but use that information to then take proactive measures as much as you can hopefully without infringing on their freedom.
Yeah, originally it was designed, I believe, to be able to look at a crime and say something qualified about who the perpetrator would be, making it easier to find them, right? That was the original purpose of that unit.
Right.
You have 10 dead girls, right? And you have a lot of forensic evidence, and you based on that, are you able to say anything about who this individual is? And it turned out, yes, you can, actually. There are some pinpointers there, right? If you're able to understand how to read the data. So that was the original. I think the original mission of that detail. And this evolves, of course. And you have now, I mean, university degrees, doctorates in the psychology of sources. So it's become a field, right? Like academic field. That's really interesting. It goes back to what we discussed earlier with we're going where the data is, or the signal intelligence is taking up a bigger part of the funding. Well, that is an indication that at least some people on the top see human intelligence that's still valuable, right? Because when you're spending that amount of researching into how does the human relationship affect this kind of work, right? So it's not as if human intelligence is no longer interesting, but it's one can note that the law enforcement seems to be leading the way here, not the military. But then, of course, they publish more of what they do than the military intelligence people do, of course. So it's more available.
Right.
But they seem busy with this. I mean, sources among criminals remains one of the better ways to solve crimes, right?
Yeah.
Because the modern criminal knows not to carry around a cell phone and knows to change cars and defeat signal intelligence, right? So you still need that human factor, which is means I won't be redundant. that's good.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not until a robot takes over your job.
That's still far out, I guess. It's the human mind still has data capacity that no computer can dream of, right? So it's
right, and all being able to actually detect and analyze and actually really dive down into someone's psyche. I don't know if computer programs can quite do that yet. So then after you left the armed forces, and then you went into psychiatry for yourself, right? You had your own business going?
Well, parallel to this, there's some overlap here, but that's not that's details. But I worked at the hospital for a number of years doing regular psychiatry and as a prison doctor, a regular doctor, more or less a GP for the inmates. Are terribly interesting. You know, you really get to investigate that factor I told you about, that everybody's got the story, right? Everybody's got the reason. Passing judgment on people becomes increasingly hard when you get to study their stories. You arrive at a point where you just go, hey, I can't judge you. You know, you're sitting there with people who've done horrific things, and you end up just, I understand where they're coming from, right? I understand the need to get that aggression projected out on their victims, not defending their acts. They're still horrible and dangerous, right? But you understand it to a level where you go, yeah, I think Jordan Peterson had a cool segment on that. He explained how he spent 6 months trying to imagine how he would be in a position where he could beat somebody to death, like the inmates of the prison he was working in. And he described it very well, right? He chased his shadow, as he said. That's a Jungian reference. And I mean, yeah, you end up there. Everybody's got their fight, right? You can't pass judgment on anyone. Everybody's just trying to survive as best as they can with the data that the world gave them, right? What happens to a 3 or a 5-year-old is extremely important when it comes to how they turn out later in life.
Yeah, I know it's not the same really comparison at all. But in a sense, so I have a puppy. Well, he's a little over a year old now, but I was reading about there's a certain time periods in the puppy's development where they are extremely susceptible to fear, and that will stick with them for the rest of their life. So I have a kind of he's now afraid of anything large, so big boxes or anything, because when he was a little puppy, one time he was sniffing around, messing around near a shoe rack, a real cheap little plastic shoe rack we had, and somehow he lifted his head up, and one of the legs of the shoe rack got stuck in his collar. And he tried to move away, and the shoe rack came with him, and it scared him. So he tried to run faster, and the shoe rack was, attached to him. So it kept following him, and he kept running. And it's been interesting to see that has stuck with him. And that was almost a year ago now. But he still carries that along with him. And to some extent, that's similar with humans then too, right? You said when you're 3 or 5, you're really impressionable.
Yeah. And it's I mean, you get goosebumps thinking about it, when you're sitting there with an inmate and you're retrograde telling their story, and you end up at some point where mom and dad committed some kind of horrible act of treason, right? Bringing in a stepdad with a taste for kids, for instance, right? And something happens and it just eliminates all faith in and trust in humanity, and everything that happens after that is just it's logic, right? It's what that poor kid learned at 3 or 5, that human beings are treacherous and dangerous, and that kind of sets them on a path that leads to you meeting them in a maximum security stockade, right? And another kid gets the most wonderful stepdad in the world, right? And he ends up being a governor or whatever. You end up in some kind of war, right? It's hard to place blame.
It does, and even like the stepdad, for example, you said if he had sexual assault issues with a minor or something like that in his past. So you can talk about the kid who committed, the person who committed the crime, but go back to when he was a kid, he had problems with the stepdad. But then you can even go back to the stepdad, and when he was a kid, he had different issues. It really kind of breaks down the whole classify everything as good and evil, right?
Well, that's actually what we're discussing now, right? The beyond good and evil, and it goes with everything, right? Who's the good guy in this fight? Who's the good guy in Iran? There are none, right? They're just people with interests. It's the same thing here. Who's the good guy in this story? Who's the bad guy in this story? This kid was destroyed at 3. Well, the guy who destroyed him, he was destroyed at 3, right? So the sins of the father becomes the sins of the son. It's beyond good and evil. That's I would say, if somebody asked me what's the most changing factor you you absorbed when taking or seeking an education in psychiatry or psychoanalysis, I'd say that really changed everything, man. Seeing that they're you can't, it's action reaction, right? Everybody becomes a victim. Everybody becomes you try to you're influenced by Western thought, and you think, oh, we have a choice, we are a conscious being, we choose blah blah blah, and that space of choice, when you investigate people's histories, becomes narrower and narrower and narrower, and you end up in where you see that it had to go there, right? There was no way out of it, and it scares the hell out of you. I mean, you get scared shitless, right? Because, oh my God, you have kids, you have a dog, you have neighbors, you're a teacher. Oh, Jesus Christ, you have to think about everything you do. Yeah, you do, right? As with your dog, you had no fault in this thing happening with the shoe rack, but it shaped him forever, right?
Yeah. So, but that could be that could be an incredibly deep conversation and getting into free will, whether or not you have the choice to. I mean, because there are people who I won't get into details of who it is, but I know somebody, and they grew up in one of the worst neighborhoods in a housing projects. Everyone around them, all their friends growing up, had babies at a young age, and are on government welfare programs and not really going to do anything with their life. But this person they went and got their master's degree, and they became a really successful person. And people still have. I think there is still some free will in there, where because of situations that happened in the past, you can still kind of decide between right or wrong, or make a choice to do something or not, to act on those predilections. Would that be the right word? It's kind of pushing you to do that, but you can, really work your way out of it and make right, more healthy decisions, I guess you can call it, instead of right or wrong decisions.
But right, you still make those decisions based on the data set the world has given you, right? It becomes an intelligence analogy again, right? What recommendations do you send up the food chain? Well, that depends on the data that you've been given, right? And it's the same thing with life. I mean, that the data set is what turns into your decision. And those people growing out of projects like you just described, I'm willing to bet my degree that if you sit down and go through their story, there's one incident where somebody said, you have a beautiful mind, you can be something, and guide them just for 5 minutes or 10 minutes and said, this is what you can achieve if you just set your mind to it. And you will find that person when you go through those stories, right? And that's what led them to do what they did. I mean, that's psychoanalysis for you, and you can doubt it if you want, because you can't actually prove that scientifically. So it just becomes now one of those statements. But my clinical experience is that you always find that metastability, right? That tipping point where those people could go one way or the other. A teacher that said, you have the ability to do this, and that stuck with them for some reason, right? You find that tipping point, that schisma in their stories. And you can say who chooses this and who chooses that. Incredibly interesting problem. Is it free will or not? Another incredibly interesting story, right? But it seems to warrant some sort of you respect for human interaction, if you know what I mean. Be careful what you say to whom.
All right, well, maybe we can move on to a different topic. One, you mentioned your dad was a nuclear scientist, right?
Yep.
And that's a topic you've always kind of been interested in, or did a little bit of study in.
Yeah, I did half the thing I needed to be in his footsteps, I guess.
Just not the math part, right?
I had trouble with the math. Differential equations, then my efficiency slowed down substantially, and that became the end of my career as a physicist. But that's where I wanted to go initially when I sought out an academic future. So yeah, and it's part of medicine, of course. I mean, if you're interested in that kind of thing, then there's a lot of studies done on the effects of radiation on the human body and health effects, right?
Yeah, that's the incredible thing. I think there's so many people who have, and I know Eric was really excited to kind of talk about this topic, and I'm sure he has different questions on it, but just how little people actually understand about radiation. It's just the boogeyman. It's a bad ghost. It's invisible. You can't see it. You can't smell it, and nobody really understands how it works. But the average person, I don't think, really understands anything about it. And actually, I really didn't until I actually talked to you, and you gave me a whole breakdown of the 4 different types of radiation. I still remember it, all the alpha, beta, gamma, and neutron radiation. Each has different effects. And you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Where do you want to start? Because that's a big field.
Eric, do you wanna head this one off? Ask a few questions.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, we can start. We'll just start with just ionizing radiation and exposure to it, right? Because like I was on a submarine, right? And one of the things I always tell people is that I slept 30 feet from a reactor for a really long time, and after 4 or 5 years of being on that thing, I got no radiation exposure. Like, because we actually will wear what we call TLDs, where they're thermolytic. I think not thermolytic. I can't remember what the actual name is, but they detect radiation exposure, right? Ionizing radiation exposure, and
Yeah, is it
it'll tell
sort
you
of a
how much you
dosimeter?
get. Yeah, it's a dosimeter, right? And it'll tell you how much exposure you get. And when I got off, I had zero, I had nothing. And so it's a lot of people don't really get it. And then when I tell them, like, well, if you're a pilot or you go in an airplane, you're going to get way more ionizing radiation than I would ever get. So, maybe you could talk about it a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's part of life. Actually, you have background radiation, right? You're radiated all the time. You have if you're on you have a radon problem in some parts of the world where you have slate as geology, and you have radon seeping into the basements, right? And you have all sorts of sources for natural exposure to radiation, and not forget the sun, right? As you said, you go on a plane ride that's 12 hours, you get a significant amount of you absorb a significant amount of ionizing radiation, right? It's not as if it's deadly in itself. It's a dose related thing, and it's not as if, like you said, you can sleep next to a reactor, like if it's shielded well enough. The problem, I think the way that radiation is seen as sort of like a bad guy in a Bruce Willis movie is partly due to the campaigning against nuclear arms in the Cold War. We're back to propaganda again, and partially because of those nuclear disasters that has happened, right? That's
Specifically about
actual
nuclear weapons a little
studies
bit,
done
maybe.
in Chernobyl.
So
Yeah, I mean the same thing about nuclear weapons, right? I think Nixon said once that it's just a big bullet, right? And that's half a truth. I think he was countering the propaganda at the time that nuclear weapons were the end of the world, right? They are most probably not I mean, a total nuclear exchange would be extremely bad, but it's not the end of life on Earth, as has been proposed. And the anti-nuclear weapon and anti-nuclear power organizations in the West, I won't say that I know that they had a hidden agenda, but you can certainly think that, right? Trying to sway the popular opinion again, yeah, and to some extent exaggerating the dangers of nuclear war, and thus how dangerous radiation really is. It's like my dad once said that he was doing this in the early years of how do you say of nuclear power and nuclear weapons, and he was irradiated on several occasions and had his testicles checked before he had kids, right, to see if his kids would be malformed or not, because he knew what kind of doses he had received. And he lived a long, happy life. Never had, well, he ended up getting cancer, but unrelated to radiation, and very, very late in life, right? So it's and all of his buddies were subject to rather impressive doses, right, on a regular basis, and most of them lived long, happy lives. So it's not as if it's how do you say, the boogeyman, but on the other end, it's not a very pleasant way to die, of course. But And I mean, okay, do we want to look at the actual scientific results from this? Then there has been some studies conducted in Chernobyl, the population there who received quite significant amounts and also ingested these amounts, which usually is regarded as a lot more harmful than just exogenic radiation, and the mortality rates aren't that impressive, to say it morbidly, right? It's not like it eradicated villages. The same with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? Look at the mortality rates in those people who survived the initial blast, right? It's not as there wasn't an epidemic of cancers, right? But people seem to think that you get irradiated, you get cancer, right? That's a common conception or misconception of it, right? So it doesn't mean it's harmless. I mean, it doesn't mean you shouldn't avoid it, but the bad guy image that radiation has. I mean, every exit sign that's glowing in the dark is radioactive, right? Every watch with glowing hands is radioactive. In the old days, your TV used to be, it was a beta cannon, right, illuminating the screen. So, yeah.
Yeah, do you remember everyone saying we would get, not everyone. There was a group of people saying that we were all going to end up with cancer talking on cell phones. I remember that when cell phones first came out.
Exactly. But then you have the other end of the spectrum. You know, you try to avoid CAT scans of kids, right? And you try to avoid radiating kids as much as possible when you're in medicine. You weigh the radiation exposure of the CAT scan machine against the need to find what you're looking for.
Yeah, I think the ionizing radiation from medical equipment is really interesting because it's very powerful. You know, you get one of these sources that are in there, and I'm not talking about like CAT scans, but I'm talking about like the old teletherapy machines and stuff like that, where they would just shoot you with a beam of it, and those things were super powerful.
Yep. And just the scans. I mean, there are instances where for instance, in cancer patients, where the tumor shrinks because of the CAT scan. Just the imagery shrinks the tumor, right? Because of the radiation. One CT scan is the equivalent of 1,400 X-rays, right? So it's not an unsubstantial amount still. And especially in kids, you take that into account, right? So it's not as if it isn't harmless, but I mean, to compare it to something, when the X-rays first came, it was the shoe stores would have X-ray machines to photograph your foot inside the shoe to see if it fit. Right, that was something that was sold in, I don't remember, the 50s or 30s or 40s. I don't remember it eludes me when this was, but that was popular, you know, to X-rays people's feet to see how the shoes fit. And I mean, the teachers of physics in the old days would start up this Bremsstrahlung. I don't know what it's called in English, where it's a way of producing X-rays, right? And they would demonstrate these tubes in front of the class, effectively irradiating everyone, right? And you haven't seen a surge in cancer. I mean, I have seen some of these alternative and conspiracy theory sites saying that cancer is increasing, but that's because people are getting older, right? If you live long enough, you get cancer. So you see no surge in cancer of the young or middle-aged, and another example, how many nuclear warheads has been fired since the first one in the Manhattan Project? About around 3,000, I think, 3,050 or something. Nuclear warheads has been fired in or under or on top of the Earth's atmosphere, and you have had an increase in background radiation as a result. And you can't find a print of that in public health, right? So the indication would be that either biology adapts or it's not as harmful as most people think.
Well, I think one of the good examples is, and I wanted to ask you about this, you, being in biology and having all of this background, is if you look at Chernobyl, it's started to turn red, and you can see a lot of the wildlife coming back. It died off a little bit there for a while, but it's pretty much almost all came back. There's some life forms that are dying off a little bit earlier. I think like snails or something like that, but like the big megafauna, it seems like it's all pretty much come back, but it's got like weird colors and it's changed a little bit.
Yeah, adaptation, right? And then it's actually, if one is interested in the effects of radiation on biology, there's some amazing scientific work done on the wildlife in Chernobyl, looking at exactly what happens to biology that lives in a high radiation environment, because parts of that nuclear core is still spread around the reactor, right, in the forests and in the water. So it's still highly radioactive environment, and so yeah, I mean, valuable and interesting studies has been done, and what they've noted is that for instance, the repair processes of the DNA, which is where to explain that short, perhaps, that the reason radiation is dangerous is because it damages your DNA. And that's not just a problem for reproduction, because DNA is used all the time to maintain life. Your skin is constantly growing, right, as everybody knows, and to steer that growing process, you apply, or the commands are lifted from your DNA. So when you damage DNA, you damage the organism's ability to produce skin and the inside of your guts and hair, and that's why that is falling off when you get exposed to high levels of radiation, right? Because you're damaging DNA all over the place. And one of the things noted in Chernobyl is that this enzyme that's tasked with running across the DNA and repairing it after this radiation has damaged it is showing increased activity. So it means that the molecular biology is adapting to the high radiation background. And what they have seen when studying these poor people who were exposed is that the level of malformations, congenital malformations, is skyrocketed right afterwards. So fetuses are still extremely susceptible, and you had an increased level of cancer for a while, but it died down again, right? And then you get a second surge of cancers that is a result of prolonged exposure. And you see the same thing in the wildlife, right? You have a lot of congenital malformations, but those who survive adapt to the environment. And as you said, I think it's the biggest catfish in Russia or something. They actually adapt quite well, right? It's not as if it's dying off. Yes, you had a period there where where how do you say, the herd was groomed, and then it grows back into the same numbers it had before, or even higher, because there's no people there, right? So biology seems to be adapting quite well. Not necessarily every individual, but as a population, biology seems to adapt rather well to high radiation environments, right? And you would expect human beings to do the same thing. And the research results indicate that, right? That, yeah, you will have a lot of miscarriages and you will have a lot of kids dying of cancer, but humanity will not be eradicated, as was communicated as, I would guess, propaganda during the Cold War, right?
So what about some of the big ones? Like, for example, they would always talk about nuclear winter or nuclear fallout. Those are the two big ones you hear a lot of. I think they're related too. But those are the two ones you hear about a lot. I think there's some misconceptions around there. Whereas if there's a big nuclear war between Russia and the U.S., say, that it would kick up all this dust, all the fallout, which would block out the sun, and it would cause the Earth to plummet in temperature. What about those?
Yeah, that's a current discussion among those scientists, because the original model wasn't that it was the dust kicked up by the warheads, but it was that the burning of all cities on the northern hemisphere would create black clouds blocking out the sun.
Oh, okay.
That was the original model. That the dust contribution of the warheads themselves were one thing, but that usually comes down quickly as nuclear fallout, right? But the burning of the cities, that no fire department would be able to put out anything in this scenario, so it would just burn to the ground, right? Most cities would just burn till there was nothing left that could burn there, sort of like Dresden, right? And that smoke would create this nuclear winter, and this was perceived as extremely probable. The man who provided data to actually study that effect was Saddam Hussein, because he ordered the oil wells in Kuwait set on fire, right? So then you had a number of oil wells burning intensively for weeks and weeks. And you get to study the behavior of that smoke and those particles and their effect on the weather. And the data from those investigations suggests that the impact will be minimal. And that has been refuted, of course, by someone or other scientists claiming that, well, you can't generalize a local event. And that might have some truth to it, and I wouldn't be able to tell you which of those are the correct model, but it would seem that the only data set we have actually is from Kuwait and Iraq and that first Gulf War, and that suggests that the effect of the climate will have an effect, as anyone who did service in Iraq at the time can tell you, that the sun was indeed blocked out by those burning oil wells and it becomes colder. But the moment they were extinguished, the thing reversed itself rather quickly. And so the only data set we have suggests that a nuclear winter wouldn't be the problem that once was proposed. But of course, the opposing argument that you can't take a regional event and make it global is, of course, a valid criticism. But it's not. It's not. How do you say? It used to be that nuclear war means nuclear winter. That seems to be a little bit more complicated than that. And from natural geography, you have the phenomenon that, you can have a lot of volcanoes active at the same time, and you get weather manifestations as they are active, but the moment they die down, it rather quickly reverses itself. So it's nuclear winter, yeah, certainly a possibility, but not an absolute, not at all. Right.
And also, a lot of it is a lot of these nuclear weapons are air bursted, so they explode in the air. And doesn't that limit the effect of the amount of fallout on the other side of this as well?
Yeah, well, a nuclear warhead, that it has to do with how clean your material is, how enriched is the uranium or plutonium you're using, and if you reach 99.9%, when you have an air burst, it will. The only fallout you will have is radioiodine, iodine 131, and that will of course come down as unpleasant fallout, but it dies down in 7 days, or the half-life is a week, I think. I don't remember exactly, but that's radiation that dies down quickly. What the traditional fallout is material from the surface being sucked up into the nuclear detonation itself and producing all sorts of radioisotopes raining downwind, and some have short half-life and some have longer half-lives, right? So they will create a carpet of rather deadly dust that will be there for a lot longer than just the radioiodine. So a surface burst would be nicer, if you can use that term at all, in terms of repopulating the area, because it produces fallout, or it produces radioisotopes that have this short half-life, intense radiation for 7 days, but then it goes away, right? But a surface burst will produce all sorts of fallout, which is why you would call that an area denial weapon, right? You detonate a nuclear warhead on the ground somewhere, and you have radioactive glass for 1,000 years, right? So it would be something if you're ethical, if you can apply that, if you're ethical
An
about
ethical nuclear war.
Yeah, in an ethical nuclear war, everything would be air busts, right? Just to say it that way. And I think there's actually I'm just guessing here, but going from, I think it was the Russian, I don't remember exactly. Everybody can Google anything these days, so I guess your listeners can find it out for themselves. But there was a general, I think, in the strategic missile command in Russia that said something along the lines of, we would like to excuse our future need to the population of Stjørdal, which is an area outside Trondheim in Norway, where the Americans have stored a lot of material in advance. So he was basically saying that we will have to area deny that area if we ever end up in a war with the United States, suggesting that we feel bad about, it could be propaganda, of course, but we feel bad about, making the middle of Norway completely inaccessible for the next 1,000 years, right? It is actually something we would like to avoid if your morals aren't completely defect, right? But yeah, back to the point. Big difference there between an airburst and a surface detonation, right? The limit being depends on the size of the warhead, of course, but it's above or below 1,000 kilometers from the surface, right? Anything below that, and it'll suck up and produce all kinds of nastiness. Above that, it will be pressure and heat, and very little fallout, and then the factor of the purity of the nuclear or the radioactive material that the bomb is created from, right?
And I think one of the arguments against nuclear power or nuclear weapons, just nuclear power in general, is that it can be a little dirty if an accident happens, right? So you look at Chernobyl, where there was an explosion, so it kind of blew over that area. You have Fukushima, where there was an earthquake, and then the tidal wave kind of rushed in, took everything out, and washed it out to the ocean. Right. There are accidents have happened. Countless. I don't even know how many reactors are sitting on the floor at this point. Not to include nuclear weapons, but one of the things is that almost all the reactors we have, if I'm not mistaken, they're all, everything that generates power, at least for the infrastructure, it's all pressurized water reactors. There hasn't been this big push for new types of nuclear power, like you have molten salt reactors. I mean, we have the energy department tweeting almost every day about kilo power, which is their little modular reactor that they're going to use to power moon bases, because yes, we are a space force and we are going to put something up there. If you haven't read through the lines yet, so there's very, very, very safe ways to produce power with nuclear fission, and obviously fusion would be that awesome thing, which is totally different, doesn't have anything to do with uranium or anything like that. So I think that's the other thing, is we have to push better technology, because if you want no CO2 emissions. It's not going to happen tomorrow. We cannot provide enough power for the infrastructure using solar and wind. It's just not going to happen right now. It will eventually, and that's great. But we got 10, 20 years. We got people like Elon Musk that has to like come up with all this shit to figure out how to do it. We need new battery technology. There's so much more we need. We have nuclear power now, and it's the only way that we can produce power where we can capture all the emissions, right? We capture all of the used the used uranium or whatever it is that they're using to power these reactors. So it is a very awesome, feasible, clean way to create electricity and power, and it can be bad, but I think we have to start cycling all that stuff out. That's old technology. Pressurized water reactors are old technology, right? Now we still use them for military technology and stuff like that, obviously, because it's probably one of the better ways to do it. And the Russians have tried to use molten salt reactors like they used in the Alpha and stuff, but we have to push all that shit away. We have to start pushing a new technology, and I think that's where you're going to have. You don't really have much to fight with anymore when it comes to it, because you're not going to do anything to those types of reactors.
Well, here's the thing. Taking Fukushima and Chernobyl and saying this proves that nuclear power isn't safe is like taking the Hindenburg disaster and saying flight is inherently unsafe. You can't compare the Hindenburg to a Boeing 737, right? And what you're doing if you're comparing the Chernobyl reactor to the most safest reactor known to man, the Can-Do reactor, the Canadian version, you're comparing the Hindenburg airship to a modern jet, right? So, the technology to do this absolutely safe has been around since the 60s or 50s, actually. It's just that, like you said, the pressure water reactors are more popular. One, because they can't produce bomb material. You can't harvest a pressure water reactor. And point number two, they're cheap to make, right? So the ability to do this absolutely 100% safe has been there for years. It's just that let's do it as cheap as possible is usually not the best idea to go about these things, right? But the fact that people are unaware that you can't compare a reactor to a reactor. The Chernobyl reactor was built originally to produce bomb material, right, and converted to electric producing facility. Doesn't sound like a good idea. The origin of the Fukushima reactor was as a naval reactor for American vessels produced by, I won't say the name, like lawsuits and all that, but it has a naval lineage, and you don't. You have want a land-based reactor. Let's design it as safe as possible from the scratch up. Inside a vessel, it doesn't matter, right? If the reactor in your submarine starts melting, you're probably going to have a bad day anyways. It'll end up on the bottom. But in Fukushima, it matters, right? Then you can. So had that been a can-do type, nothing would have happened. The same thing in Chernobyl. Had it been a can-do type, nothing would have happened. That's just an example because I'm familiar with the can-do design, right? But the technology and the technique to do this a lot safer exists. It's just very expensive, or just more expensive, right? And there's a big differentiation there. Right? Why we are still flying Hindenburgs to this day, I don't know. Even the Swedes have this Fukushima reactor in operation, and that could scare you, right? Because it's an unpleasant thing. But hey, let's be reasonable. Let's compare it to mortality then. Let's see what are killing people. Is it radiation after Chernobyl? There's still more people dying of, diabetes or lifestyle disorders, right? That's the big killer nowadays. Overweight and sugar and all that. That's a bigger public health issue than cancer and then radiation related cancers, right? So it's kind of it's always more complicated than people seem to think, right? A nuclear power plant is not necessarily comparable to another one. You have to look at how it's designed. And the Chernobyl reactor and the Fukushima reactor were subpar designs. That's why it happened, right?
Yeah, but unfortunately, you can't boil that, like we were talking about earlier, you can't really boil that down to a headline. Like you said, it's a lot more complicated than people will make it out to be, but people like to read just the headlines, just the exciting part of the story, and not go read through the whole article and delve down into the details.
Right, and you can see the difference between the Hindenburg and an airship and a plane, right? So there's a difference, and you can see the difference between a Cessna and a Boeing 777. But you can't see the difference between an unsafe and a safe reactor. You have to know something about it, right? That goes for politicians as well, right? If you ask them what type of reactor should we be building here, this one is 4 times as cheap. Oh, let's go for that one, right? That's kind of a little bit of the problem here. You can make safety your primary concern. I think the Finns did that and sought out, the safest designs they could, and it works wonderful, right? And it's a very sexy source of energy if done correctly, right?
Yep. So, Eric, do you have any other questions before we wrap up?
I think a sexy source of energy is a good way to wrap it up. I think that's a good way to go out.
Well, it is.
All right. Well, real quick before we go, though, I want to mention one of our other sponsors is NordVPN. If you go over there, you'll get 75% off. 75% off. I believe it's $2.99 a month. So it's a major discount. It's really important to have a VPN. Protect yourself while you're online. It's nordvpn.org/TechOps. You'll have to use that coupon code to get that 75% off. nordvpn.org/TACOPS. All right. Well, if we don't have anything else, I think that's it. Unfortunately, I believe you told me you were working on a few books, but you do not have any completed to promote yet. So maybe we'll have to have you on again in the future when you get your books finished and published, so we can help you out and get some sales there.
I'll very much like that. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's it for this episode, and we'll see you next time. Tech Ops is owned and operated by hosts Eric M. and Greg R., along with producer Kyle Smith. Copyright 2019. Music by Kevin MacLeod. Twisted. Creative Commons 3.0.